in Europe, and I've been spending quite a bit of time in Sweden, among other countries. And there are, now it's not terrorism on a daily basis, but there are so many societal problems that have broken out in Sweden in the last few years. And you very, very rarely see anything about it in the press and the media in this country or in America. And I think that what happened in this is emblematic of a problem. The non-coverage of that, of a very serious story, and then a sort of cack-handed reference to it by the American president that is responded to by the liberal media saying, ha ha ha, it's so hilarious, Sweden's just this wonderful place where everyone's just doing IKEA stuff all the time, is a horrible, horrible deepening of the divide.
You are about to witness an intriguing discussion on the extent of attention and coverage that the government and media provide to murderers, and whether it is practically right to give them the publicity they seek. Douglas Murray's insights throughout the discussion offer a clear perspective on this concern. Providing media coverage to murderers or jihadists can have significant impacts and consequences for the country. Let us explore Murray's take on this issue.
The non-coverage of that, of a very serious story, and then a sort of cack-handed reference to it by the American president that is responded to by the liberal media saying, ha ha ha, it's so hilarious, Sweden's just this wonderful place where everyone's just doing IKEA stuff all the time, is a horrible, horrible deepening of the divide.
I think if you believe that the terrorists should be starved of the oxygen of publicity, why are you here? My point of view, for what it's worth, is that I don't think terrorism is very important. And I think we make it important, and by making it important, we make it important. It does not matter very much. A terrorist incident is a happening, it's an accident. It affects the people directly affected by it. But terrorism does not threaten states. It doesn't threaten the integrity of America or Britain. They can't invade us. They can't do serious damage to our economy unless we let them. They cannot affect our values, our democracy, anything like that, unless we let them. They are, to all intents and purposes, useless criminals. They simply blow things up and kill people. The only point at which they threaten us is by our reaction to them. They have no standing whatsoever, other than in terms of our reaction to them. And our reaction to them is conditioned by the publicity we give them. They depend upon publicity. The multiplier of publicity is what makes the terrorism act terrorist. Otherwise, it's just a killing. That's why very few terrorist incidents occur in autocratic and dictatorial countries. They don't get any publicity. They get publicity where we give them publicity, and it's on that publicity that they feed. ISIS, interestingly, last week said they regard publicity as their nuclear weapon. It's the thing they rely upon to make their impact. We've become completely obsessed with them. Terrorism has been seized upon by the military defense establishment, effectively to boost their budgets. Terrorists should be dealt with by crime watchers, by police, by intelligence agents, and so on. They're not a source of aircraft carriers or bombers, all that sort of thing. We have gone far too far in reacting to them, and Donald Trump, who sooner or later will be mentioned this evening, illustrates that so well by saying we should give them more publicity. What a lunatic thing to do. I simply think that the best thing we can possibly do is you cannot not cover news. And I'm sure tonight we'll discuss what this really means. You can't not cover news. You then hand the terrorist over to the much more terrorist thing, which is the rumor. You mustn't allow rumor to dominate news. But we mustn't over-exaggerate the significance of a terrorist incident. The BBC spent 4 days on the Nice atrocity. Obama comes over to march in honor of the Hebdo massacres. It was an appalling way of glorifying this particular obscenity. I feel so strongly that the least we can do to publicize terrorists, the more we're likely to defeat them.
Simon Jenkins, a British author, asserts that terrorism is only considered terrorism when the country and the media give it attention. In most dictatorial countries, this news is not widely covered by the media, and Jenkins believes this is the right way to handle the issue. He also condemns Donald Trump's opinion, as Trump previously stated that murderers should be given more publicity and attention.
Insurgency. Terrorism is a mechanism, it's not an ideology. Terrorism is a form of attack. You try and kill people, you try and cause an atrocity in order to terrify someone, to change them, get them to change their mind or change their policy. ISIS is an insurgency, which is occupying territory now. That's a completely different matter from terrorism. They happen to use terrorist methods, but they're not, their essence is not terrorism. Their essence is the setting up of a caliphate. So, I mean, I come back to my point. There's no point in terrorism if you don't give it publicity.
Okay.
He says that not giving them publicity could be a step towards protecting the country, as the chances of them invading the country are quite slim. Additionally, the purpose of murderers will not be fulfilled if they are not given enough publicity or attention from the media, Jenkins adds.
Insurgency. Terrorism is a mechanism, it's not an ideology. Terrorism is a form of attack. You try and kill people, you try and cause an atrocity in order to terrify someone, to change them, get them to change their mind or change their policy. ISIS is an insurgency, which is occupying territory now. That's a completely different matter from terrorism. They happen to use terrorist methods, but they're not, their essence is not terrorism. Their essence is the setting up of a caliphate. So, I mean, I come back to my point. There's no point in terrorism if you don't give it publicity.
Okay.
Fawaz states that the attacks generally serve two purposes: to conduct wars in various countries and to gain attention and publicity. The extremists crave such attention to instill fear in the government and the public, terrorize their enemies, and most importantly, to potentially influence people with their propaganda who might be interested in joining their cause. According to various studies, groups like ISIS and Boko Haram often exploit young people, using them for various roles, including combat and support. Young males are typically targeted for combat roles, while young females may be used in support roles or, disturbingly, as suicide bombers.
We should tell the audience about, the effects of terrorism, the impact of terrorism, as opposed to, you know more than I do, how many days we have spent on the, terrorist attacks in Paris or Brussels. They were horrible, they were insidious, they were dangerous. But it was a kind of, playing into the narrative of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, giving them ammunition, providing them with the oxygen. This is their greatest jihad, because they appeal to the base. We are invincible. We are indefeatable. We are bleeding the West, terrorizing the West. In a way, it's the oxygen that sustains the narrative. And again, we are terrorizing our incidents. Final point, I know we'll come back to it. Let me turn the table on its head and say we're talking about whether terrorism provides oxygen to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Let me say that as a result of this obsession, in fact, our coverage and obsession with terrorism, we are providing oxygen to populist movement in Western societies. We are distorting domestic politics in the West. In fact, this obsession with these kind of limited threat is providing oxygen to hyper, far-right movements. And in many ways, it's really changing, dramatically transforming Western politics, not just playing into the narrative of ISIS.
Not likely. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very glad this isn't a debate format, because I think this question is so complex, and I think most of us have such contrary views on this. It's a very good thing that it's not set up as an either-or thing. The first thing I would say, but I agree very much with what Fawaz just said about that Cameron point. I entirely agree. I thought it was an absurd, indeed obscene thing for a Prime Minister of the UK to say that ISIS is an existential threat when it's no such thing. However, I do have to push back a little on something that Simon has already said. Terrorism can do serious damage. And as everybody knows, just from that one thing that's already come up twice this evening, the attacks in Paris in November 2015, it still is doing damage. Still, the Parisian economy, the tourist economy is not recovered from that. It's still a city suffering from that. Now, I don't know how you could get into a situation where multiple suicide bombings go off in the nearest capital city to this one, where multiple suicide bombings go off at a football match, at a rock venue, drive-by shootings, Kalashnikov attacks in cafes and restaurants, and that wasn't reported, or it just was mentioned, and we all got on with our lives. The public want to know that information. We want to know, I'm going to go to Paris next weekend. Is it a wise idea? Is it good to go or not? Of course we need this information, and we need the media to be reporting it. And I have to say that we have to appreciate what the end point of Simon's point of view on this is. In 2013, when two British converts to Islam, two very radical young men, ran over in broad daylight in South London, in this city, ran over a soldier at home on leave from Afghanistan, Drummer Lee Rigby, hacked at his body in the middle of the road, tried to get his head off with machetes, and so on. Simon described that as a mundane act of violence. Now, I don't think that is a mundane act. It was in your Guardian column at the time.
Oh, sorry.
Anyhow.
It was a mundane act of violence.
But you see, for most of us, the general public, we don't think that the reporting of a soldier being decapitated in broad daylight by two such men is a mundane thing. It is certainly an act of violence, but we have to be very careful. That is the end point of dismissing the terrorists, of saying we don't give them any oxygen. We try to get around it in some way. Now, I think, by the way, that the censorship around terrorism already exists to an enormous extent in our societies. The media in this country and in America and elsewhere don't show anything like explicit images of the aftermaths of terrorist attacks. And there is a very good argument that actually if the public saw what those of us who've covered and seen attacks have seen, that their views on this would be a lot harder than they currently are, and that the media actually holds this back from the public, and that as a result the public are less enraged than they would otherwise be by this. But you know, if you support the motion tonight, how would you do it? How would you stop covering the terrorists when they carry out an attack in Paris for night and kill 130 people and leave many more wounded for the rest of their lives? How would you do it? How would you do it in the age of the internet? Okay, it's plausible you could get a press regulatory body so rigorous that it stopped the remainder of the print press from publishing any information about it. People would go to the internet. How do you shut down the internet from covering this? Now, having said that, there's one very important point on this, which is that obviously the press have to show restraint. And I want to give you two very quick examples in my life of the press clearly not showing restraint on this. And this is where there will be some unanimity on the panel tonight. In 2004, when the British-born man Ken Bigley was held hostage in Iraq by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's group, many of you will remember this. There was a drip feed of information on an hourly and daily basis by Zarqawi's group. And they knew, and we knew from the moment that American forces ended up getting into his compound, that his group were watching the British media like hawks, because Tony Blair was being personally held responsible by a man being held hostage with a knife to his throat. And if you remember, that man, Ken Bigley, was saying on camera, "I blame Tony Blair." And the British press were blaming Tony Blair. And there was a moment there where the combination of an extremist group and the British press effectively helping them could well have brought down a prime minister in a democratic society. It came very, very close at that point. And the second example I would give was 10 years after that, in 2014, when Jihadi John, as he was called, Mohammed Emwazi, another British citizen, was executing, murdering, beheading people in the Syrian desert. I would argue that was another time when the British press needed to show restraint, and a lot of it did. You'll remember that The Independent ran a front page saying that we are not showing the photo of this. That may have been an extreme example, but the British press, once again on that occasion, the international press, were being used by that group to have this drumbeat of terror. So on that, I think there'll be some agreement. I think that the British press, by and large, does show restraint. I don't think we can not cover the terrorists, but there are occasions when the press in this country and elsewhere has got it very badly wrong.
Well, so let me ask you, you bring up...
Douglas Murray correctly raises the question, how is it possible for people to not capture such incidents on camera and publish them in the age of the internet? He suggests that the media should cover the bloody and gory incidents and the aftermath of such attacks to make the public aware of the harsh reality out there. I fully agree with Douglas Murray.
No, I mean, what you're essentially talking about amounts to self-censorship on a certain level. And I just wonder, does it confuse the role of the journalist at all? Because the journalist traditionally is not supposed to be a judge. The journalist is supposed to be someone who is a filter, who provides information to people who want to receive that information.
Well, I mean, let's go back to that point. What makes news? News of someone issuing a press release is boring. News of somebody saying, I think you're a bunch of infidels and I wish you'd change your minds and become Islamists, is boring. So they do something truly horrific because they know that horrific things make news. You then have a problem. That's what they want you to do. I mean, it's because some Chinese philosopher said, always ask what your enemy most wants you to do. We always answer terrorism with what they most want us to do. We fall straight into the trap of doing what they want.
But is it not our job?
Well, it's not our job to do their job for them. It really isn't our job. But what I do think is new, and this is, in a sense, the point where we might discuss it, is this is quite unlike other forms of news. This is a form of, when you're covering a war, you're covering a war. In this case, you are a part of the story, because that's what the other side wants you to be. And in becoming a part of the story, you are, as you said at the beginning, a part of the problem rather than the solution. And I just think, what I'm saying here is I think for newspapers, it is no good simply saying, we cover every story. Because in the first place, you have, as we've been saying, you have a decision to make about how intensively you cover it. I mean, do you fly Hugh Edwards out to Nice, which is what the BBC did? I mean, that's exactly what I'm sure I said. Please, will you fly Hugh Edwards out to Nice? Thank you very much, BBC. You've done what you wanted to do. We wanted you to do. You have a decision to make as to how intensively you cover a story. But I go beyond that, really, and say you are now the story. You are a part of what the other side wants to happen.
So,
and you can't just simply say, it's like another story.
Okay, Douglas, do you agree with that? Is there essentially a synchronicity going on, or a symbiosis between ISIS or groups like ISIS and the media? Are they kind of playing into each other somehow?
Yes, they are. I mean, we know the extent to which people, for instance, in ISIS use the internet to see what their coverage is like, that day. I mean, there are cases of this. So there's obviously a synchronicity. I think, by the way, the whole thing plays into a thing which, I mean, it's not just on this subject, but on any subject. What is the normal routine in the media now in the era of 24-hour news? Something happens, you need somebody to react to the something, then you need somebody to bring on the story. But every journalist, anyone who's ever worked in journalism will know this, you get a call from BBC, CNN or something. The Prime Minister said this about this happening. I wonder if you'd call for this. And you think, well, no, usually. Usually it's, in politics, it's somebody calls for somebody's resignation. That's another kick of the wheel. The story goes on a bit longer. Now there have been calls for the resignation of this person after this thing that's happened, and so on and so on. So there is a momentum to all news stories. Keep pushing it forward. And the reason why, I mean, personally, I don't watch if you don't mind me saying so, the 24-hour news after any terrorist attack, because something terrible has happened, and one doesn't learn very much about it by the presence of said major reporter standing some miles away, from the scene. Or the best one, not to be too light-hearted about it, but it wasn't the terrorist attack. You'll remember that when that Russian submarine went down, Donetsk, some years ago, the BBC ended up renting a helicopter to fly over the sea to show a bit of sea. And then on air, it turned out that they weren't allowed to fly over the bit of sea which the submarine was under, because the Russian authorities had ordered a blockade over the airspace. So the BBC, just at enormous expense, had covered a bit of sea like the bit of sea.
Okay, fair enough.
Murray explains the relationship between extremist groups like ISIS and the media. The way such groups publicize their acts is perfectly captured and published by the media. And in fact, that is their aim, and the media is indiscriminately fulfilling their goals. Media outlets, due to the nature of news coverage and the demand for dramatic stories, often report on these groups extensively, which can be seen as falling into their trap. So as the media serves the public with coverage of such issues, is it also trapped in the cycle of this substantial issue?
Is there essentially a synchronicity going on, or a symbiosis between ISIS or groups like ISIS and the media? Are they kind of playing into each other somehow?
Yes, they are. I mean, we know the extent to which people, for instance, in ISIS use the internet to see what their coverage is like, that day. I mean, there are cases of this. So there's obviously a synchronicity. I think, by the way, the whole thing plays into a thing which, I mean, it's not just on this subject, but on any subject. What is the normal routine in the media now in the era of 24-hour news? Something happens, you need somebody to react to the something, then you need somebody to bring on the story. But every journalist, anyone who's ever worked in journalism will know this, you get a call from BBC, CNN or something. The Prime Minister said this about this happening. I wonder if you'd call for this. And you think, well, no, usually. Usually it's, in politics, it's somebody calls for somebody's resignation. You know, that's another kick of the wheel. The story goes on a bit longer. Now there have been calls for the resignation of this person after this thing that's happened, and so on and so on. So there is a momentum to all news stories. Keep pushing it forward. And the reason why, I mean, personally, I don't watch if you don't mind me saying so, the 24-hour news after any terrorist attack, because something terrible has happened, and one doesn't learn very much about it by the presence of said, major reporter standing some miles away, from the scene. Or the best one, not to be too light-hearted about it, but I mean, it wasn't the terrorist attack. You'll remember that when that Russian submarine went down, Donetsk, some years ago, the BBC ended up renting a helicopter to fly over the sea to show a bit of sea. And then on air, it turned out that they weren't allowed to fly over the bit of sea which the submarine was under because the Russian authorities had ordered a blockade over the airspace. So the BBC, just at enormous expense, had covered a bit of sea like the bit of sea.
Okay, fair enough.
What we need to understand is that there is two wars. And the other war, the media war, really is strategic for both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That everything they do in order to really, get attention. Everything they do is they want to instill fear and terrorize the public, whether you're talking about Iraq or Syria or Libya or Western societies. In many ways, we have to make decisions, how much coverage we give to the, certain particular attacks. Let's remember, again, I'm taking you away from, the media itself, that initially ISIS is not really was not interested initially in carrying out attacks against the far enemy, against Western societies. In fact, ISIS differs dramatically from Al-Qaeda because the basic focus of ISIS is on the near enemy, whether you're talking about Iraq or whether you're talking about Syria or Libya or Egypt. The reason why ISIS has decided to attack Western target, because again, because it perceives basically the US-led alliance with France and the United Kingdom. So in this particular sense, we need to talk about why ISIS has decided to attack certain Western target. What has happened? What's the strategic mindset of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS? We're not doing this. And in many ways, if you follow, and in fact, ISIS is delighted by the coverage it's getting, whether you're talking about Brussels or Paris or Germany or other places.
So what's the alternative, though? I still don't really have a feel for what the alternative is.
I think we have to talk about these attacks. But think about it. You covered the attacks in Paris. Non-stop for days, several days, every single television stations. The amount of coverage is overwhelming. It's just overwhelming. You covered it yourself. And this is exactly what ISIS wants you to do. You're basically playing into the narrative of ISIS because ISIS basically is appealing to the base. ISIS is motivating, inspiring the base. And also ISIS is saying, well, look, we have capacity. We have capacity to strike at the heart of European societies. It's also as a recruitment technique. And we know, in fact, we have covered, after every attack, basically increased number of young men and women who tend to migrate to these particular groups, whether you're talking about Syria or Iraq or Libya.
It is clear that while reporting on murderers or jihadists cannot be entirely avoided, the media can take measures to prevent glorifying them and inform the public without perpetuating their agenda. One effective strategy is to avoid repetitive coverage of the same incidents, as this can easily result in undue sensationalism, which is typically expected by extremists.
Well, what do we do about it? Reasonable question.
Because we have a responsibility to our viewers and our readers too, and they do care about terrorism. They do think it's important.
Care important?
Yeah, we can all sit here with our lofty ambitions and be like, oh, they don't understand, it's not strategically important. But they do feel it's important.
It's ghoulish. It is a particular sort of horror deliberately designed to appeal to the ghoulish voyeurism in the viewer. That's what they're doing. Now, the question is, how do we respond to it? Now, it's a good, reasonable question. I think myself that it is, as I said before, it's quite unlike any other story. We're not just covering a story. We're covering a very particular sort of story, and I just think it's incumbent upon the media represented here to ask themselves now, how do we exercise self-restraint? Because it is about restraint. I mean, at the moment, I mean, an American president is building his presidency on terrorism. It's ridiculous. How on earth do we draw back from the state of this obsessiveness? I think, for what it's worth, that the press regulatory bodies, such as they are, and the professional bodies, ought to be preparing protocols, conferences, discussions about how we react to terrorist incidents. They ought to be, I mean, most news organizations, I think probably including yours, do have a sort of protocol. I mean, Le Monde tried to restrain naming terrorists. A lot of press organizations have ways in which they do handle this, and they are moderately effective. But I can see a situation in which almost the government of the day says, not censorship. It says, look, you guys, you're really a part of the problem. You're a menace.
But it's a fine line with censorship.
I mean, you asked, I mean, of course the public apologies. Do you want to finish?
Yeah, go on.
I mean, the question is, to what extent does the coverage, the extensive, the overwhelming, the addictive coverage really produce certain public reactions? To what extent, in many ways, we are pouring, I mean, gasoline on a raging fire? Just at the end, the last year of Barack Obama, the American public, I mean, we have surveys about this. The American public was, I mean, almost majorities opposed to any kind of American intervention, other in Iraq or Syria. And in the space of about 4 or 5 months, there was a marked, basically, difference in the reaction of the American public. A majority of Americans basically, I mean, the views changed dramatically as a result of the media coverage of the barbarities that basically taken place against Americans. Well, I don't know whether there was a causal link between how the media covered particular events and the change in the American attitudes about intervention, or whether somehow, I mean, the barbarities themselves brought about the change in the American public.
And I think you raise an interesting point there, and I wonder, Douglas, if you could sort of expand on that a bit. You know, is there an argument to be made? We've heard President Donald Trump come out and say, we're not covering terrorism enough. And to all of us who work in news, I think we were like, you must be taking the piss, was probably the first reaction. Yeah. And then they provided this list of, you know, I mean, various attacks in Europe, many of which, in fact, we hadn't covered because they were incidents where maybe one person was stabbed, and because the threshold is probably quite high at this stage for it to become a, you know, leading a news broadcast. But
you didn't do enough on Sweden, did you?
But do you think there's an argument to be made on the other side that we're not covering it enough, that we're trying to sanitize it, that by not showing the images, as you said, that by not sort of, you know, going over every single incident?
Well, can I, firstly, the press already, the media already does a fair amount of editorializing before you even get to the discussion we're having. Let me give you one example. ISIS, which is the subject of Fawaz's book.
Thank you.
If you'd like to hold it up again. No, I've got a 10% deal on this. ISIS now the main broadcaster here in the UK, the one that we all pay for, the one that is, I think, responsible for the fact that our media is not as divided as it is in, for instance, in America. There's much to be said for the BBC. The BBC chose to not use that term. It's so-called Islamic State as the BBC. Well, that's an editorial decision it takes about the group. I've often said, if I keep on hearing the BBC called the so-called Islamic State more times, I'll put my so-called shoes through the so-called television. But it's an infuriating editorial decision, which they've taken before you've even got to reporting the story. That's why you can speak to a lot of people in this country who, despite this, what we're talking about here as being an over-coverage, still have very little idea of what it is that ISIS wants. Because we actually don't have a lot of that discussion, because our broadcasters and our press don't want to have a lot of that discussion. And so we go round and round on the pornography of violence. I'd much rather we had those bigger and deeper discussions that meant that people knew what was actually going on with this group, what they actually want, and what groups like them want. But just very quickly, I've got to pick up as well on this mention about Sweden, if I may, because this actually does get to a core divide that's going on at the moment. I do not enjoy the bifurcation of American media, I have to say. I don't like the fact that increasingly these are two sides talking about each other, but never to each other. And I think it's enormously regrettable for democracy as a whole. That said, there is a specific problem which the Sweden story actually talks to. Now, as it happens, I've just finished a book which Fawaz will be, by agreement, promoting any moment. No, which comes out in May. But it's about the migration crisis in Europe. And I've been spending quite a bit of time in Sweden, among other countries. And there are, now it's not terrorism on a daily basis, but there are so many societal problems that have broken out in Sweden in the last few years. And you very, very rarely see anything about it in the press and the media in this country or in America. And I think that what happened in this is emblematic of a problem. The non-coverage of that, of a very serious story, and then a sort of cack-handed reference to it by the American president that is responded to by the liberal media saying, ha ha ha, it's so hilarious, Sweden's just this wonderful place where everyone's just doing IKEA stuff all the time, is a horrible, horrible deepening of the divide.
May I just, I'm glad you have mentioned Donald Trump, and what really worries me a great deal is not about whether we discuss, the phenomenon of terrorism. We should. I think the phenomenon of terrorism is going to be with us for the next 20, 30 years. It's byproduct of globalization. It's part of breakdown of societies in the Muslim world, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria. Really what we are seeing in the West here, basically the reverberations of the breakdown of the state system in many countries. This is just, that's why I said it's nuisance. What alarms me a great deal is when I hear Donald Trump and other politicians in the heart of Europe collapsing terrorism with the refugees, collapsing terrorism with migration, collapsing terrorism with Islam. And then you have a big existential problem in our hands.
Groups. The real question arises, is the media exploiting extremist group content for personal gain and creating unnecessary confusion? Douglas Murray precisely points out that the media often fails to cover the crucial aspects of this issue, such as the real injuries and aftermath. Additionally, he discusses the situation in Sweden, suggesting that the reality there might not be as accurately portrayed on TV, with multiple underlying societal problems going unvoiced. Do you think the media is divided and serves impartially?
This is really where Western politics now, this is the question, this is the challenge. How do you separate, how do you de-link the phenomenon of terrorism, which is dangerous, in a limited way, right? Limited way. I call them really organized networks criminality. Why do we treat terrorism different than the mafia? Why do we invest terrorism with existential cultural overtones? The overwhelming majority of Muslims, this cliché, have nothing to do with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. The overwhelming majority of victims are Muslims, whether in Iraq or Syria or Libya or Egypt or Afghanistan. But this is what we really are going round and round the question. To what extent does Donald Trump now use, and he has used the question of ISIS very effectively, politicians in the heart of Europe.
Douglas itching to just get in there.
It's slightly off the topic, but it reiterates the point I was just trying to make, which is that an absence on one side creates something on the other. And this is a very good example. I said it for a long time. If your entire media says that Islamic extremism has nothing to do with Islam, you will create a movement that says it's all to do with Islam, and all Muslims must be involved. In the same way as if you pretend that no migrant into Europe is ever going to be anything other than the most brilliant PhD student, you will create a movement that says they're all terrorists. That is part of the problem.
Simon?
But how do you answer the problem? I'll come back to Clarissa's question. You've got a peculiar thing here. You've got a requirement which all intelligent liberal people say, which is to cover responsibly world events. There are lots of terrorist incidents in the Congo, in Uganda, or Nigeria, or Sudan. We just don't cover them. It's darkest Africa. We don't cover them. It doesn't matter how horrific they are. We don't cover them because we've got this thing. We cover terrorists. And terrorists is something that happens to us in our country, not in their country. Now, if we give terrorism what I still think is a ludicrously exaggerated extent of coverage, and I wouldn't go as far as you or Douglas in saying, I want to show pictures of the dead bodies as well, in order to enrage the population even further.
We should, but yeah.
I just want to suppress that, because unless you suppress these sort of tabloid images, it's very difficult to get a conversation going about what is happening in Nigeria or Sudan or somewhere else. And I do come to a point which I never ever thought I would in my life, of saying that I just somehow think the concept of censorship, self-censorship, but censorship, has got to be part of this debate, and it has not become that yet.
But let me ask you this then, Simon.
That's not an answer, there's a question.
Yes, that's why I'm the moderator and you're the panelist.
I don't think the answer to the points we've been making is oh, you might lose money. I'm old-fashioned enough to think that journalism is actually about a certain sort of ethic, in which you try and find out what the truth is. You do not exaggerate the truth, you present the truth. You don't become a part of the story, you stand back from the story. All these things old as the hills. Always nagging at our shoulder is the Sun or the tabloids or Hearst or whoever it might Pulitzer. I mean, all these old gorillas, always saying, oh, give us a better story, give us a better story. You make more money that way. The reason why I'm proud of journalism is for 100 years, enough journalists have said, I'm not going down that route. I'm going down the route which simply says what I think to be the correct way of looking at the world. I'm going to go on doing that.
Today, the media is certainly prioritizing their television rating point shock value over comprehensive reporting. This certainly does nothing but glorify the extremist group. By focusing on the most dramatic element, the media can inadvertently fulfill the extremist goal of spreading fear and gaining notoriety. What are your opinions on this? Do you think the media should give attention to such extremist groups? Let us know in the comments. If you want to watch more such videos, make sure to check out our channel.